Hello, my name is Saba Bazargan-Forward. I'm an associate professor at UC San Diego, and I'm going to be presenting on what beneficiaries of collectively committed wrongs owe. So the issue is whether the innocent beneficiaries of a wrongdoing owe compensation to the victims of that wrongdoing, if for whatever reason it's impossible to force the wrongdoer to pay up. The view that the innocent beneficiaries do indeed owe compensation is known as the beneficiary pays principle, which I explain in further detail in the companion introductory video. So theorists have applied the beneficiary pays principle to a wide range of debates in political theory and social justice. The focus on benefit as opposed to blame for wrongdoing expands the scope of our compensatory duties in ways that profoundly affect how we should respond to past and present collectively committed wrongs, including the wrongs of sexism and racism, colonialism, poverty, climate change, and so on. And I'm going to argue for the BPP by defending the view that benefiting from a wrongdoing, the benefiting itself, feels a duty towards the victim. And in arguing for the BPP, I'm going to use examples that include up to 3 characters: wrongdoer, beneficiary, and victim. I'm going to argue that beneficiary has a duty towards the victim because she has benefited from what wrongdoer committed. But in contrast to many of those who agree with me about the BPP, I'm going to develop grounds for the BPP. So we need to get straight on what we mean more specifically by the BPP, and I do that in the 5-minute companion video to this presentation. The upshot, though, is that according to the version of the BPP I defend, the beneficiary of a wrongdoer's actions has a directed, enforceable duty to compensate the victim of that wrongdoing by transferring to her the non-generative benefits conferred upon the beneficiary. And she has this duty because the beneficiary benefited from wrongdoer's actions, rather than because she caused it, or because she sought the benefits, or because wrongdoer intended beneficiary to benefit, or so on. What follows, I develop a basis for the BPP. So let's start with the following case. And in this case, there are only 2 actors. It's wrongdoer and victim. And I call this case trespass, and you can follow along on the handout that I've provided in conjunction with this presentation. So in this example, victim owns a small parcel of land. She's cultivating a lush meadow. To prevent others from trampling the burgeoning shoots and sprouts, she posts no trespassing signs. Wrongdoer, nonetheless, takes a shortcut across the parcel of land in order to catch a bus on time. No one, aside from victim, notices this trespass, and wrongdoer does not cause any discernible harm. Only repeated instances of this kind of trespass will impede the meadow's growth. So what is the victim owed by way of compensation? Now, it might seem that victim is owed nothing, since she was not deprived of anything. She's made no worse off by wrongdoer's trespass. Does this mean that wrongdoer owes nothing in compensation? Not so, I think. Wrongdoer, in effect, non-consensually extracts a service from victim when he commits the trespass. Now, at first, this claim might seem odd. I mean, after all, wrongdoer did not physically force the victim to perform an action or otherwise coerce her into doing so. But the idea, rather, is this. Victim was in a position to provide a valuable service for wrongdoer. She could allow him to cross the meadow, but she's under no obligation to provide that service, let alone for free. If she had wanted, she could have charged wrongdoer a fee in exchange for permission to cross the meadow. By crossing the meadow without victim's permission, then, wrongdoer makes use of that service without victim's consent. In this sense, wrongdoer non-consensually extracts a service from victim. On the count I defend, wrongdoer must provide compensation no less than the value of the service he non-consensually extracted from victim. Victim is made whole only once she's provided with an amount no less than the value of that service. Otherwise, at least in this case, victim is used as a mere means. But how do we determine the value of that service? The benefits the service confers determine its value, I think. Maybe wrongdoer commits the trespass for reasons of convenience that allows us to reach his destination sooner, or maybe he commits the trespass to get a closer look at some of the flowers on wrongdoer's land, or maybe he commits the trespass on a dare. There are a variety of ways we might quantify the value that the act had to wrongdoer. And in doing so, we need to resolve whether we should advert to wrongdoer's subjective well-being or his objective well-being. In addition, the single act of trespass might have far-reaching consequences. we need then to consider the cutoff point when measuring the difference that the trespass made to wrongdoer's life. So clearly, the issue of ascertaining and quantifying the relevant value is a morass. Fortunately, I don't need to resolve it here. It's enough for my purpose to note that there is, for wrongdoers, some value in committing a trespass. I'm going to put aside what that value consists in and simply call it V sub W. Wrongdoer thereby owes victim at least V sub W in compensation, modulo the constraint of proportionality. So, if the good that compensation confers upon the victim is sufficiently small and the harm it causes wrongdoer sufficiently large, it might be better to allow him to defer payment until such time that its effects on him are not catastrophic. But putting that aside, so suppose, though, now that the service wrongdoer extracts from victim confers benefits not just on wrongdoer, but on a third party as well. So consider the case that I called brick dump. So a ton of bricks blocks access to a nearby river, and wrongdoer takes it upon herself to have the bricks moved so she can access the river. In doing so, she illicitly dumps the bricks on victim's land. Now that the bricks are moved, beneficiary, who lives by the river, has access to it. He benefits by what wrongdoer did. Beneficiary, though, played no role in and was ignorant of wrongdoer's plan. Victim, meanwhile, is saddled with the bricks on her land, which cost him $7,500 to properly dispose. So here, wrongdoer illicitly extracts a service from victim by dumping the bricks on his property without his consent. Victim had no obligation to provide that service cost-free. He was entitled to demand remuneration for that service. Clearly, wrongdoer would have to compensate victim by paying for the damage she caused. Call it D. In this case, the cost of repairing the damage is the $7,500 in fees to remove the bricks. But if what I've argued is correct, wrongdoer would also have to compensate victim by paying V sub W, which is equivalent to the value that dumping the bricks conferred upon wrongdoer. So wrongdoer owes D plus V sub W. In this case, though, wrongdoer's illicit acts confers benefits on beneficiary as well, though beneficiary did not contribute to and is not otherwise responsible for what wrongdoer did. Now call this amount, the amount that beneficiary benefits, V sub B. We might determine how much a V sub B is by estimating the amount beneficiary would have agreed to pay in exchange for access to the river. Alternatively, we might look to the market value of beneficiary's newfound access to the river. Perhaps the value of his home increases, and V sub B might then be worth that amount, or the amount that an instrumentally rational party would have negotiated in exchange for the increase in the home's value. In any case, whatever route we choose, let's stipulate that V sub B is $5,000. I claim that beneficiary owes a victim V sub B. Now you might think, why should beneficiary be forced to pay that amount when she's not responsible for the wrong in the first place? And the answer is this. Though beneficiary neither contributed to nor is responsible for D or V sub W, she is indeed a cause of and responsible for V sub B. By electing to keep the benefits that that the wrongdoer's actions conferred upon beneficiary, beneficiary thereby adds to the value of the service wrongdoer extracted from victim. In doing so, beneficiary exacerbates the wrong that victim suffers. Transferring the benefits to victim mitigates that wrong by diminishing the unremunerated value of the service that wrongdoer non-consensually extracted from victim. Now, given that victim is entitled to the value of the service she unwillingly provided, and given that beneficiary adds to that value, he owes precisely that amount in compensation. Of course, gaining V sub B is not under beneficiary's control by hypothesis. I mean, the benefit falls on him like manna from heaven. But the decision to keep those benefits is indeed under beneficiary's control. As a result, he can be held responsible for that difference he makes in the value added to the service extracted from victim. The result is that beneficiary is morally required to address that difference by compensating victim. In other words, by transferring V sub B to her. Now, it's clear that beneficiary adds to the value of the service wrongdoer extracts from victim. But why believe that this exacerbates the wrong that a victim suffers. After all, that added value doesn't go to wrongdoer, it goes to beneficiary. But wrongdoer's illicit act consists effectively in compelling non-consensual labor from victim. By adding to the value of victim's labor, beneficiary thereby increases the amount of non-consensual labor extracted from her. As a result, victim can demand from beneficiary precisely that difference he makes. So this point can be generalized in what I call the service principle of compensation. I won't read it off, it's on the handout, and it's just a slightly more formal summary of the points I've made so far. But if the service principle is correct, victim is entitled by way of compensation to D plus V sub W plus V sub B. The problem, though, is by hypothesis, wrongdoer is dead or can't pay for whatever reason. So who ought to foot the bill? Now, it's unjust to force beneficiary to pay its entirety. After all, beneficiary did not contribute to and is not otherwise responsible for what wrongdoer did. For this reason, it would be unjust to force beneficiary to pay D, in other words, the $7,500 removal fee. In addition, the service extracted from victim is valued partly at V sub W because the wrong conferred benefits on wrongdoer. But beneficiary is not responsible for the existence of those benefits, so it'd be unjust to force beneficiary to pay V sub W. By hypothesis, though, beneficiary is indeed responsible for retaining V sub B. So it would indeed be just to force beneficiary to pay V sub B. So the moral here is that whether wrongdoer is able to compensate victim need not affect beneficiary's compensatory duties. Regardless of whether wrongdoer pays, victim is required to transfer to victim, beneficiary is required to transfer to victim the value he added to the service wrongdoer extracted from victim. That is, beneficiary is required to transfer to victim $5,000. This upshot parts ways with the claims that other defenders of the BPP make, namely that beneficiary owes victim only if wrongdoer is unable to pay what he owes. But if the service principle is correct, beneficiary owes V sub B either way. Now, this raises the worry that the service principle overcompensates victim. After all, transferring D plus V sub W plus V sub B to victim seems to make her better off than she would have been if wrongdoer had not committed the wrong. So I turn to this worry and related worry next. So on the service principle, a victim is owed V sub W, which seems to make victim better off than she would have been if the wrong hadn't occurred. Now, this is going to strike some as at odds with the basic function of compensation, which is to make the victim whole. If she's made better off than she otherwise would have been, it seems to make the victim more than whole. But I don't think this is correct. It's true that compensation's function is to make the victim whole, but it's up for grabs what counts as this. The worry that the service principle overcompensates victim presumes that if you are left with more by way of assets, you are thereby made better off. And it's true that if wrongdoer is forced to transfer V sub W to victim, then victim will have more by way of assets than she would have had absent the trespass. But this doesn't mean victim is made better off. This is because compelling a non-consensual service from someone is typically a wrong. It accordingly requires compensation. And victim has an exclusive right to use of her meadow. By trespassing on the meadow for his own purposes, wrongdoer in effect forces victim to provide for free a service which she is entitled to charge. This is a wrong requiring compensation. So to leave her as well off as she would have been absent the wrong means providing her remuneration for the service she unwillingly provided. And the value of that service determines the proper remuneration, and that value is V sub W. Since her service is worth that much, providing her with that much doesn't leave her better off. It instead effectively pays her for the service she unwillingly provided. Okay, so now return to cases where the BPP applies. In such cases, by retaining the benefits, beneficiary has made it so that wrongdoer's wronging of the victim is worse than it otherwise would have been. By adding to the value of victim service, beneficiary thereby increases the amount of the non-consensual service compelled from her. And again, if compelling a non-consensual service is wrong, then presumably demands compensation. Beneficiary is thereby responsible for the difference he makes to the value of the service victim unwillingly provided. And by compensating victim accordingly, she isn't made better off relative to the status quo ante, even though she may have more by way of asset. Instead, again, she's paid for the service she unwillingly provided. There is, though, another sort of worry pertaining to overcompensation. What if a service non-consensually extracted from victim is worth far, far more to wrongdoer than it is to victim? So consider the case that I call Fanatic Trespass. And this is just like Trespass, except catching the bus on time is instrumental to seeing a star-studded movie premiere, tickets for which are worth $500, but for which wrongdoer would have paid as much as $10,000 if necessary to attend the premiere. Does this mean that wrongdoer owes victim $10,000 by way of compensation? No, or at least not necessarily, since the market value of the opportunity to attend the movie premiere is only $500. So wrongdoer might owe no more than that. But regardless of how we assess V sub B, by the market value of the benefits, by what victim would have paid for the benefits, or some objective measure of the benefit, the fact remains that on the service principle, when beneficiary retains V sub B, she increases the unremunerated value of the service non-consensually compelled from victim. And this in turn augments what is owed in compensation. So I take it to be strength of the service principle that it is not wedded to any particular method of assessing the value of the benefit. Okay, so I've addressed the worry that the service principle overcompensates those who are arguably owed some compensation. I'm going to now turn to a different worry. Grounding the BPP by adverting to the service principle might mean that the BPP applies to too many cases. It might seem to overgeneralize. So consider the following case, which is from the literature, and which I call terrorism luck. Wrongdoer, a terrorist, sets off a suicide bomb in a building, maiming victim. The explosion and the ensuing emergency divert foot traffic, as a result of which beneficiary, who is walking on his way to work, takes a route he wouldn't have otherwise have taken. And while doing so, he happens to find a $100 bill. So regardless of how we calculate V sub B in this case, it seems absurd to suggest that beneficiary owes victim anything. Indeed, if all events, no matter how antecedently unlikely, and no matter how causally distant, are included in V sub B, then there's no principled reason to stop when beneficiary finds a $100 bill. The path that beneficiary is set upon as a result of what wrongdoer did to victim will have innumerable and endless effects on beneficiary's life, and therefore innumerable and endless benefits and costs. Indeed, the same goes for wrongdoer himself. How then do we quantify V sub B and V sub W for that matter? Now note that ordinary accounts of compensation, in which a wrongdoer culpably harms a victim, suffer from the same problem. What counts as a harm? Put differently, how do we quantify D? We presumably do not include all the harms resulting from the path that the victim's life now takes, even though those harms would not have occurred but for the wrong in question. It's no surprise then that the service principle of compensation inherits the same issue. So in this respect, the problem isn't unique to the account I've developed here, but I'll still provide a tentative solution. I propose that in determining what's included in V sub B, and V sub W for that matter, we discount the candidate benefit depending on the extent to which it counterfactually depends upon events intervening between the moment wrongdoer committed the wrong and the moment that beneficiary benefited from it. So to put it more intuitively, in terrorism luck, there are many such events. A lot had to go right following the bombing in order for beneficiary to find the $100 bill. And the bombing did little to ensure that benefits would proceed in the way that they actually did. Now contrast this with brick dump. When wrongdoer moved the bricks onto victim's land, this virtually guarantees that wrongdoer would have access to the river. If we discount a candidate benefit in accordance with how robustly it depends on the wrong, then we avoid having to consider all the benefits and harms that the wrong causes. Where the counterfactual relationship between the wrong and the benefit is sufficiently fragile, as is presumably the case in terrorism luck, then the benefit will be de minimis. We can discount the benefit in V sub B altogether. So we have then a principled reason for thinking that the service principle will not yield the unintuitive conclusion that the beneficiary owes compensation in cases like terrorism luck. So to conclude, the service principle grounds the BPP in a way satisfying all the conditions I adumbrated in the companion piece, the introductory video in which I introduced the notion of the beneficiary pays principle. So that's to say that the service principle grounds the view that benefiting from a wrong as such confers a compensatory duty for beneficiary, and beneficiary has such an enforceable duty, and the duty is directed, even if she's innocent and that she never sought the benefits, she's not a cause of the wrong, the benefits are non-generative, and wrongdoer did not mean to aid beneficiary. The result is that the beneficiary of various collectively committed harms, such as the beneficiaries of excessive greenhouse gas emissions, the beneficiaries of bigotry and rape and sexism, the beneficiaries of neo-colonial exploitation, have duties towards the victims in virtue of having benefited from the wrongs inflicted on them, even if the beneficiaries are not responsible for those victims. And the implications for this view, I think, are wide-reaching. Okay, thank you for your time.